Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Drew Vasuka, I'm Head of Research and Practice Innovation at Metropolitan Workshop, and I'm joined by Ava, who is Metropolitan Workshop's Researcher in Residence for the purpose of this project, which is People Powered Places. I'd like to welcome you all to the event, which is to mark the publication of People Powered Places, and really begins the next phase of a self-initiated research project where we're going to be trying to get to the bottom of what makes for excellent and good and excellent. Good and excellent work in communities. The project seeks to explore the best practice in community participation in planning and housing and enable capacity building within Metropolitan Workshop so that we are better able to support our clients to meet the needs and aspirations of communities and building users. I'm incredibly grateful to Ava, who was largely responsible for the preparation of the practice paper, which is available on our website, and which I'm sure will become an invaluable resource as we enter the practice development phase of People Powered Places. Thanks also to co-editors of the paper, Lee Mallon, who conducted many of the interviews, and Neil Deedy, whose foresight led to the selection of the topic and our investment in this form of practice-based research. I would also like to extend thanks to Pia Berg, Richard Robinson and Kruti Patel, and all the contributors to the paper for bringing this phase of the project to successful completion, particularly given my extended leave of sabbatical leave. Our project will culminate in a practice primer produced for and by colleagues across our studios in Dublin and London that will better define how we work with clients and communities to promote more meaningful participation in planning and housing. I hope that as the project enters its next phase, colleagues within Metropolitan Workshop will seize the opportunity to learn from the experts we invite into the practice and help shape our collective approach to community participation. Ava.
Hi, everyone. So today our panel is going to be chaired by Metropolitan Workshop's own Denise Murray, a senior associate within the Dublin studio. She has gained practice experience at O'Donnell Toomey Architects and Fielding Clegg Bradley Studios and has been influential in adapting Metropolitan Workshop's approach to the Irish context. Joining Denise are Dr. Andy Inch, Keith Brown, and Chris Stewart. Andy is a senior lecturer at Sheffield University, Department of Urban Studies and Planning. His academic experience is motivated by the belief that planning should be a means of democratically shaping more just and sustainable futures. Andy's research explores the political dimensions of planning, approaches to opposing new development, participatory approaches to citizen-led planning, and the temporal dimensions of planning and imagined futures. Keith is a key contributor to our practice paper, where he offers an insight into his understanding of what community empowerment really means and how it can spark further self-initiated projects based on nearly a decade as a trained community organizer in the UK and as well in the US. Keith has been instrumental in enabling and motivating effective community participation in his previous role as Nationwide's first community organizer at their first development in 100 years at Oakfield in Swindon. And this experience has explored valuable approaches to develop an understanding of what new communities need and want, where perhaps the community itself is still forming. Drew, back over to you.
And finally, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to embarrass Chris now. So we're joined by Chris today from Collective Architecture. The cooperative's entry into Jeremy Till and Tatiana Schneider's seminal survey of the expanded field of architecture, spatial agency, or the ways of doing architecture notes. Collective Architecture's inclusive and collaborative approach to architecture is characterised by who they choose to work with, social enterprises, housing cooperatives, local manufacturers, and what they choose to build, mostly public projects, including housing and community spaces. I've enjoyed this collaborative approach working with them as a client on a range of residential and care and support projects in the northeast of England, the northwest Midlands, and one of our last projects was in London. Today we will be discussing an incredibly ambitious consultation project they have recently undertaken on behalf of the Scottish Government called Housing to 2040. This project seeks to set a vision for housing for the whole of Scotland for 2040 and aims to deliver a safe, safe, good quality and affordable homes for all. Their project has seen them travel the length and breadth of Scotland, speak to a different range of communities with different housing aspirations. As somebody who's basically attempted to do this on Tyneside, I think the scope that the project has is phenomenal, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the methods that were adopted for a national scale project. Before we hand over to Denise and let our speakers go through their project, Neil would like to say a few words about the project and also how it fits into our wider vision for Metropolitan Workshop's development as a practice. Thanks, Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Drew. Hi everyone, and welcome to all our guests. I'm Neil Dealey. For those of you who don't know, I'm co-founder and partner at Metropolitan Workshop. We established MetWork in 2005 to practice differently through genuine collaboration, both in the generation of our ideas internally and in their realization with others. We refreshed our values 2 years ago as rigorous, inventive, generous, and inclusive. And it's the last of these values, inclusive, that I guess is most relevant to this topic today. We see dialogue as fuel for design, and that dialogue needs to come from, of course, within the practice, but also, unsurprisingly, it has to be garnered with existing communities in the neighbourhoods where we work. Their stories about the past and their hopes and dreams for the future of places in which they live must be an integral part of forming a meaningful brief, testing proposals, and then in assessing the success of homes and places in use. Without this, how can we be sure as architects and urban designers that we are creating socially sustainable places with residents that meet their needs and support our clients to undertake more inclusive placemaking? Where opportunities have presented themselves, Metropolitan Workshop has done much already to engage effectively with communities to help them shape a vision for the places in which they live. I suppose for me it all goes back to Ballymun in Dublin in 1996, where David Pritchard and I, and then Tom Mitchell, worked intensively with the community there to end many years of 7 failed master plan processes and help to provide a really positive way forwards. That project is still happening. It's probably only about halfway through, 25 years on, but I think it's a really good example of having faith and building trust slowly through having an open and honest conversation and listening, and then responding directly to what was said. It all sounds quite straightforward and hard to argue with, but it's obviously much more difficult than that. Through to the Carpenter's estate today, where Pia and I and the team are still working with Catherine Gregg and others with the same techniques 25 years on. And regardless of all of the kind of digital media we have and ways in which we're learning to communicate in recent times, phone calls, and especially in recent times, phone calls and leaflets are still very much in use. But also, you know, people's needs and fears have not changed very much in 25 years either. So whilst we all feel as though we're sort of jumping along and accelerating into the future, actually the needs and wants of communities we work with are actually sort of very similar from decade to decade. Working with these communities and others has taught us a great deal, yet we can always improve our practice. And MetWork is becoming known for having an open approach to collaborating with communities, and this means listening and also learning as we go and building capacity in communities and in our own practice, which will take time and takes energy and takes a lot of focus. This research and practice innovation project, People, Power, Places, offers us all an opportunity to promote shifting the approach from community consultation to community engagement and further to true participation. That's the aim. Practice workshops throughout the year will explore the issues ranging from social value in design to the role of design code that design codes play as tools for participation and planning, and digital approaches to participation and inclusion. These topics have been selected because they relate directly to ongoing reform in the planning system and procurement approaches in the UK. And in particular, they should also help us move the dial in Ireland too, where our approach there seems to be really valued. Our practice paper has captured contributions from leaders and emerging practitioners in the field of participation and planning and housing in the UK and the Republic of Ireland and Germany. So thank you to any of the contributors that are on the call at the moment. They include Catherine Gregg from Make Good, Keith Brown from formerly of Nationwide Building Society, Leslie Johnson from Phoenix Community Housing, Nicola Bacon from Social Life, and a whole host of others, Chris as well. Today, it's wonderful to be joined by members of that team and speakers in Berlin, Dublin, Edinburgh, Glasgow, London and Sheffield. We hope you'll find this session really stimulating. We hope it helps you think about your own practice in a different way, as well as helping us think about ours. And we hope that you have lots and lots of questions for our guests following their presentations and the panel discussion, which Denise will, I'm sure, very, very skillfully chair. So over to you, Denise.
Thanks, Neil. Welcome, everybody. So as Neil was saying, we're going to have the presentations now. So Andy, followed by Keith and then Chris. Andy and Keith will be roughly 15 minutes each, and Chris has a slightly longer time slot, about 25-30 minutes. If you can be thinking about your questions as you go, feel free to put them into the chat as you go, but we'll keep the kind of panel discussion and questions till the end, just not to interrupt the flow. I'll also be in charge of keeping an eye on time, so if I feel we're in danger of running over, I will prompt the speakers to wrap up with a 2-minute warning and another warning at 1 minute, 1 minute if that's okay. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy as our first speaker.
Thanks very much, Denise, and thanks to everybody for the invitation to speak and to find out about the project and to read the practice paper that I really enjoyed. A lot of really sort of inspiring and interesting stuff there. So please do nudge me about time as well. I'm a terrible timekeeper when speaking, I'm afraid. Can we move this slide on? Whoever's doing that, is it Drew? Yeah, that's brilliant, thanks. So a bit nervous being invited to talk to architects, actually. For a start, my slides are just not beautiful enough ever, but also kind of being invited to speak to sort of experts in public engagement and community engagement and with so much experience, rather than just kind of a dozen bored students with their cameras off who I struggle to get to participate in classes generally. So but please bear with me. Because I was a bit nervous about this, I thought it was worth turning back to this book just because of the title, if nothing else, because I don't often get invited to talk to architects, and I wondered if Colin Ward's experiences would help me. And I find Ward a really interesting point of reference generally, I think, for thinking about what it means to think about kind of real empowered, community empowered citizen control, and his sort of gentle anarchism, which questions the role both of the state, the role of the market, but also the role of professionals and the ways in which professionals engage with communities. And one of the things that I kind of took from reading back through this again is this sense of kind of how alienated we are from the production of the built environment generally, and the sense that we live in societies where we are alienated from the production of the built environment, and where things aren't open to us to exercise agency and control. Now, I'm not sure I'd like to live in a house that I built myself, but that was kind of one of the things that Ward was fascinated by, this idea that the environment itself should be open to people so that they can continually engage in projects of taking control and shaping change. And I think that's something we can keep hold of when we think about the realities of citizen engagement. How true are we to those kind of ideals? How close do we get to those ideals, or do we feel really uncomfortable with them? And I think professional practices and the kind of institutional context that we work through and that we engage communities through really kind of are challenged by some of these kind of ideas. And so I'd like to use this as a kind of framework to think through some of how I think some sort of fairly critical comments about how I think engagement works in planning in particular. So can we move this slide on? Is that all right? Thanks. So this doesn't show very well, is it? It's a bit too big. This is an image that I overuse because I think it says something important about the mainstream discourse about participation, which is that kind of a bit like sex, even when it's bad, it's good. It's a good thing. We must all participate. There's kind of an imperative to participation across so many different elements of our lives now. And it's been kind of established as a good thing or the good thing. And we see lots of images of kind of happy, smiley people taking part in this fun thing called participation, which apparently enables them to shape their environments, and everybody feels kind of feels good about it. And it's cuddly and fuzzy and friendly. And I think that I wouldn't dismiss the possibilities for participation to be positive in those ways. And particularly at a kind of project level, I think there's real scope for achieving some of what Ward's interested in. But I think in general, we don't live in a society that really enables that kind of participation or non-alienated involvement in the production of our environments. And I think for really important reasons that we need to think through, and that maybe kind of as I think through various forms of engagement of my own. Some of that is looking academically at the kind of histories of public participation, quite critically. Some of it is through ongoing involvement with a charity over about the last decade in Scotland, which has kind of campaigned for a fair and inclusive planning system, and so sort of tracking citizens' experiences of trying to influence decisions about development through the planning system. And some of it is now in a new project which we're just starting, which is about the hidden histories of kind of more positive community-led planning, when communities kind of seek control outside of the kind of formal institutional structures of planning. So that project's still in its infancy, but I hope we'll have some interesting sort of things to say about all of this. Can we move the slide on, please? So it's taking a bit of time to come up. Some of you may well recognise this kind of this image, these line drawings that come from the Skeffington report produced in 1969, slightly over 50 years ago then. These fantastic line drawings that were part of the report People and Planning, which was where kind of formal participation was first really discussed and introduced into the planning system in the UK. And the kind of the first recognition that planning was an area where people should be involved. And Skeffington did fundamentally recognise the right of people to be involved in decisions that affect their lives. So it is quite important, and it's seen as this key reference point in the history of public participation. 50 years of this, though, 50 years in which actually the starting assumptions of that haven't really been questioned or picked up very often, and certainly not formally by governments. So it was celebrated at the time as being groundbreaking. Planning was one of the first areas of public policy to get interested in participation, actually, which is interesting in and of itself. And obviously, it's become a much broader kind of a thing now. The drivers actually were kind of diverse, though, I think, for Skeffington. Partly it was about this concern about citizens mobilising against development. So partly it was about kind of how do we manage discontent with planning? How do we manage kind of discontent and the legitimation crisis of state-led planning and the planning profession in the 1960s? So partly it was about democratising and recognising people's rights. Partly it was about dealing with the legitimation crisis, perhaps. Skeffington came up with a lot of different recommendations, some of which even remain quite radical to this day, of employing community development officers, perhaps community organisers around the country to engage people, of allowing people kind of as citizen scientists to be involved in the research for plan making. These are things which haven't consistently been ever picked up. And in fact, kind of a lot of the recommendations were only picked up in quite narrow ways. But even at the time, Skeffington was criticised for being rather narrow, for being focused entirely on participation in the statutory planning system, rather than enabling a wider idea of how people could be involved in shaping the future of their places. And Skeffington was also kind of, I think, shot through with a set of tensions around who it is that turns up to participate. And that's why these kind of images are really interesting to look at and to reflect on. You know, we want theatre, not bingo. There's a real classism there, isn't there? And a sense that middle class protesters were perhaps being overly noisy and overly influential in planning. And I think that's something which has remained to this day, a sense of anxiety around, you know, who turns up? Do the right people turn up? And do they turn up and say the things that we're happy to hear? Can we move the slide on, please? Just waiting for the next one, hopefully. Yeah, so Skeffington instituted, I think, a set of kind of tensions into public participation, or reflected a set of tensions that remain in public participation to this day. One of them was rather obviously between kind of representative and participatory democracy, and the balance between kind of citizens, particularly citizens mobilising and often oppositionally mobilising in relation to development, and the role of the state in legitimately determining how places should change through the planning process. So I think that the kind of the representative participatory democracy tension very much remains to this day. And actually, a lot of the recommendations of Skeffington were delayed because local authorities were very resistant to it. And I think these tensions and potential conflicts remain. Can we move this slide on as well, please? I think now the nature of our planning system and regime has also changed since the era of Skeffington, and we are now very much living in a much more market-led system. Although it was fairly market-led, and there was still a lot of state-led projects. And now we're very much in the realms where other people propose development, and there's a planning system that kind of mediates and has a look at that in the middle. And the planning system sometimes, and councillors and public planners sometimes sit between the proponents of development, developers, the community on the other side, and they kind of sit between and try and mediate. This image comes courtesy of the always great planning shit on Twitter, but shows some of the attitudes perhaps that we might have towards the forms of market-led kind of planning and development-led planning that we now have. But the role of the market and the market in determining change perhaps really limits the scope for meaningful public participation, and certainly means that the idea of kind of citizen control in Ward's sense is very, very distant from the way that this system really works. And I think we see this played out, these kind of tension plays out into the ways that public participation gets talked about in the planning system that we have today. So statements like this are all over different planning policy, and I take an example here from work in Scotland, review of the planning system in Scotland. But I think if we parse statements like this carefully, they're worth a close reading. They're kind of in the slippery language of policy. That's both a bit boring and sometimes a bit difficult to do. But that first sentence in particular, I think, is important here, that we need a planning system that reaches out to people and encourages them to welcome and influence change. It suggests, I think, that people are being invited to participate, but they're only really welcome to participate if they come because they're willing to welcome change. So their attitude to development needs to be a certain way, or else they're perhaps not quite so welcome. And that really sets the tone, I think, for the ways in which public participation works. The right to participate continues to be recognised, but the realities of participation are that people are only really welcome to participate if they're kind of coming along and saying the right thing. And there are multiple different purposes for participation then. That previous slide also talked about kind of increasing trust and legitimacy in the system through participation. I'm not sure that happens if you're kind of already determining what the answer should be when you invite people to participate. And there are now kind of really serious concerns about levels of trust in our planning processes, because I think of this kind of tension that's instituted between a perceived need for development and what that means in terms of who you're willing to invite and listen. And that feeds through also into the attitudes of professionals. And I think this slide, the quote here, I won't read it all out, but the idea of antsy little communities getting involved is incredibly important in terms of kind of our understanding. It comes from a research project that I was involved in, of kind of what happens when, sorry, just let me check my notes. What happens when cultures are formed around the assumptions around development and development being in the public interest, development's in the public interest. Anyone who's getting in the way of that development is therefore not welcome. We begin to see communities as being these antsy opponents, perhaps coming back to the anxieties that were expressed in those Skeffington line drawings 50 years ago. But this suggests a not entirely healthy relationship, I think, between people and planning and the ways in which it's trying to make places. Can we move the slide on again? Yeah, thanks. I think whilst waiting for that, I think, there's a slide that's disappeared from that. That's okay though. So sorry, I'm just distracted by the chat. So I think what we see in that kind of quote about antsy communities is we see communities treated as a third party in planning, and that's often the term that's used, isn't it? So the first party is the applicant, the second party is the local authority, and the third party is the afterthought to some extent. Perhaps the third party has less rights, less power, and less rights to power in the planning process. And I think it's really important to think about those relationships and how those relationships work to communities. I'm struck in architecture that this is perhaps somewhat different, but I was really interested by the kind of client relationship and how that works, and how that came through the document that was prepared ahead of this meeting. Because in a sense, there's kind of a relationship to the client and then a relationship to the community, which is shaped through public participation. And I wonder whether that creates a similar kind of third-party dimension. There was a further slide which I was hoping to show, which illustrated the effects on people. Actually, that a lot of. Sorry, can we go back to the last slide, please? Jumping around a little bit. Oh, yeah, that one. The dilemmas and responsibilities. That's great. Thanks. Because I'll say a little bit about this and then end there. Through my work with planning democracy, I've been involved in meeting with and speaking to a lot of people who have tried to influence the planning process in their communities, and often find themselves deeply alienated, deeply mistrustful, and using very strong language to describe that process as something which really rides roughshod over them. And it brought me back, I think, to this further quote from Colin Ward, which doesn't come from talking to architects, but comes from forward to Nabil Hamdi's book, Small Changes, which I come back to kind of regularly, about the dilemmas and responsibilities arising from temporary involvement in other people's lives and hopes. And I think that sums up perhaps the ways in which, as professionals, both planners, but also perhaps architects, but also kind of through projects or through the planning system, we engage with people in thin, episodic ways. And we engage in the ongoing flux and flow of their lives and hopes, but we impact on them in really significant ways. And I wonder to what extent we really take those responsibilities to care for people seriously in public participation, and whether we're as cognizant as we should be of the difficulties and the challenges and the damage that can be caused by public participation. Which is the kind of the quote which wasn't there, but the kind of the sense that public participation isn't always a nice cuddly thing of people having fun, that often people can be quite injured through the process, they can be hurt and damaged, and alienation can be reinforced, particularly when I think attitudes like those that suggest that communities expressing or getting involved in a process can be considered sort of antsy and getting in the way and being obstructive. And rather than trying to understand people's lives and hopes, rather than being enabled to be involved in people's lives and hopes in a more meaningful way, this is kind of the kind of damaging, alienated version of our current systems of planning and development, which I think if we come back to Ward and to his aspirations for citizen control and for people to have ongoing agency in producing their environments, I think we're a long way from that in the work that I've done and the work that I'm doing. And I think we need to rethink our mainstream approaches to planning and development, and we need to rethink them with people at their heart. And the 50 years of experience of public participation in planning doesn't necessarily suggest that we've found those solutions yet. And in fact, maybe that we've learned all that much, because we seem to be repeating many of the same things. Those line drawings from Skeffington remain as salient now to debates and concerns and anxieties around whether the right people are turning up, who's turning up. We continue to not resource engagement in people's lives and hopes. We continue to not resource kind of community levels of governance and control over people, over our lives in the ways that enable that. There's a final slide there, which is kind of some theoretical footnotes in a way. These are the theoretical reference points that I would use to ground a lot of this argument. I'm not going to talk through this slide because I think I've probably had my time. So I am very happy, however, to provide a kind of to provide these sort of further discussion around these points. These are the kind of the guiding kind of theoretical principles that have guided me in arriving to the conclusions. But I won't talk to them because I think ending on the kind of the where have we gone since Skeffington, and what have we learned, and how involved are we in and how do we get involved in people's lives and hopes is the key point that I was interested in getting across. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was really interesting. Lots of food for thought. If we can just move on then to Keith, and then we'll have kind of questions and comments at the end. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keith, community organizer. I work for Nationwide Building Society on a development in Swindon, as Ava said. I focus on community. Oh, can I get a slide? I focus on community and the expansion of citizen control in communities. Let's move on to the next slide. There's plenty of research on the why community participation is important. But I'm going to say personally, I believe that the majority of people holding power aren't going to make the changes that we need to make the planet safe for the future. The changes are only going to be made through a positive collective action. So when more people come to understand and embrace their power, community, they will make the changes that need to be made. So fostering community participation is the step in that direction. Next photo, please. My focus today will be on barriers as opposed to the whys, because there's plenty of writing on the whys. And I believe the first barrier is just for the power holders to acknowledge how committed they are in participation. And funny enough, Dr. Inch, 1969 must be a great year for like thinking about this, because on the next slide, I'm gonna talk about Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Participation, which she published in 1969. So I'm gonna go through all of the rungs, of her public, her guide for public participation or understanding of public participation. So the bottom rung is manipulation, which is, of course, the furthest power holders can be from genuine participation. They know what they're going to do, and the object is to get somebody to agree and create the illusion of participation. The second rung is therapy, and that's coming into a community to deliver healing or an intervention, or telling people that their community is broken. And for me, that's one of my pet peeves, when outsiders come into a community and say it's broken. People in the community can say that the community is broken, but that still doesn't give the outsiders the right to critique the community. That is for them to say. Participation is more about listening than telling or judging. So the next rung is informing. And that's just one-way communication with no channel for feedback, still telling, not listening. Rung 4, we're moving up, is consultation. That's an exercise in allowing the community to be seen and to express themselves. Listening or implementing anything the community says, or any community ideas, are not required. And rung 5, placation, and that's getting closer. It's listening, but still not trusting the community to know its needs. So that's all of the steps before we get into actually doing community participation. So I want to talk about more barriers before we get into like the good meat and potatoes. So the structures, just like Dr. Inch said, the structures and prejudices that existed in 1969 are still alive and well. Community members may not know about the ladder of participation, but they have a gut feeling that these things are being done to them. They may not be able to name them, but they definitely know and have a history of disappointment in trying to, help frame or decide on how their future area space will develop. So the playing field needs to be leveled, because it's not, and it will take time. Just like Neil said, it takes time to build trust, and that needs to be encountered and, you know, being thought of and planned for before you start. Transparency, building trust. You know, you want to come and share your aims, your budget, your limitations, and all of that should be open to public scrutiny and conversation. And when I say building trust, I do mean both ways. So trust needs to be given, and I'm also talking about the power holders coming in with humility. Like I mentioned earlier, you know, you go into a community to be educated. You go into a community believing that the people in the community hold the ideas on what's best. You should expect each and every one of the people in the community to be able to teach you something. Come in hungry, come in with the mindset that your work is there to collaborate, and you're supporting communities and taking the lead. And that creates the biggest legacy, the ripples that'll just like go out further in the world than, you know, than ever expected. So let me finish the last bits of this ladder. So partnership, and this is it. We're in the meat and potatoes. This is the space for collaboration, like building something through give and take, having trust, transparency, listening, responding, negotiating to get to a point where everyone is happy to move forward. So, and then we look at the final two rungs, delegated power and citizen control. So partnership is where you want to work as you're developing and creating something. You want to move on to delegated power and citizen control as you, the power, the developer, the, you know, planner, are leaving. So the final two rungs are like a path to leaving and what should be left behind. So, you know, you want to have delegated power moving into citizen control, which gives first the community power, the majority power in decision making, and building up to them having absolute control. You know, and that's, you know, that's what we want. You know, when more citizens embrace their power, there'll be more questions that will come up on why life is the way it is on a precipice, you know, and there will be answers in the community, and like people will be engaged to make change. And that's, you know, that's, like I said, what I want to see. That's what I hope for. Oh, do it. I have one more. Oh, that's the same slide again. One more slide just to finish it up. I am actually done. I hope I wanted to make sure I said everything. So I hope I wasn't too fast for people, because I can also run over time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That was perfect, Keith. Thanks so much. It's so good to get the viewpoint of somebody who's working, you know, on the community side. But we'll come back to questions and more of a discussion at the end. So Chris is going to wrap things up from the speaker's point of view, and then if you can be thinking about questions now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. First slide, please, Drew. I've probably got too many slides, so you could probably run through these quite quickly. I also stuck a few slides in just to tell a little bit about collective architecture, but I'll skim these very fast. But we're almost very fast. But I mean, participation has always been quite key to our company, and that there are just some examples there that you're kind of skimming through of methods we've developed over what are the past 24 years in the way we do them, and we have become an employee-owned trust. So we've taken participation into the way that we actually govern our company, and to quite a high degree, in that we're all equal owners, which is probably another conversation in itself. But the next slide then, Drew, please. I think Drew kind of like put this kind of point to me, and I'm going to talk about the Housing 2040 exhibition and consultation process that we went through. But the idea of and he wanted me to talk about it actually kind of organising something wider or broader about that. But what don't know if anyone's got a big grey rectangle on their screens, but what we kind of like. Is everybody else able to see this okay?
Hi Chris, I can see the screen. One thing I would ask is I'm wondering if everybody can turn their cameras off who isn't Chris. Also, David Mulligan, for some reason we're sharing control of the share screen. So I wonder if you could just dial off and dial back on. That would be really helpful. Like you're moving the slides now. If you can just stop. Thank you.
Oh, I see. All right,
so there were two of us trying to control that. So Chris, do you want to just?
All right,
we let you start again.
Yeah, I won't dwell on this anyway. But I mean, the idea of participation goes right. That's okay. You can move on to the next slides, Drew. That's okay. Move through them, and we'll move on a bit. Move on. Next one, and stop there then. So that kind of like that. So participation actually is like in our blood. Even in the way that we kind of like organise and run our practice, it's very democratic. I'm really interested in seeing Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation. I've not seen that for a while, and that was absolutely fabulous. And I do know there's going to be a talk about that quite soon. And I was really quite inspired by both the speakers there because there's a lot of thoughts that they have I kind of share. But in many respects, next slide, please, Drew. This kind of leads on to what I'm going to talk specifically about, and that is Housing to 2040, which it's kind of like it was an exhibition, but also an exhibition that we had to create to gather information about the people, Scotland, the whole of Scotland, people's thoughts on what they thought about housing might be as we built up to 2040. A weird number for them to choose, especially when you think about it in terms of the targets being set for net zero carbon, but they chose 2040. But that's some of the challenges that the Scottish Government put to us. It had to include everyone somehow. It had to cover the whole geographic spread of Scotland. And in that, we've got to catch a whole variety of environments. And Scotland, and as does England, as does everywhere else, has a huge housing heritage. So somehow we've got to synthesize that down into a series of information that we can actually convey across to the general public. And how do we actually then encourage future thinking? How do we actually encourage, it's roughly 2020 we did this, how do we actually encourage kind of like consultation? So the way we kind of headed out to kind of do that was we had to then, consider, first of all, there's the whole logistics of it, the fact that we had to get around the whole country, and how would we do that, and how would we actually get an exhibition around the whole country, because obviously these things can be heavy, and we had a very minuscule little budget. But the starting point for us was just to think about the geographic spread, the nature of the environments across Scotland. So we broke Scotland down into a series of cities, towns. Everybody thinks of Scotland as a nation of towns. Well, everybody in Scotland does, as a nation of towns, and more rural areas, and also island communities, because we've got a lot of island communities in Scotland. So we broke them down into these, as you can kind of see, and we had to visit every single one, and we had to get our exhibition to every single one. I think we possibly have lost a slide there, but we also had to book the venues. We had to find places that we could actually take people to. So we had to discover ways that we could actually then engage with these communities, because we'd only be there for a day. Or 2 days. If it was quite far away, we may stay overnight, and we had to transport all this information around. So the first step for us was to actually just find places that we could go to, and we used schools. Schools we discovered would be the kind of easiest way for us. In many respects, we find them as the easiest way for us to access communities, in that schools are very much at the heart of it. It varies in cities, but in rural communities, they are very much at the heart, and they have venues, they have halls, they have places where they can kind of accommodate us. So we worked on that became an important part method for us find a way into these different communities that we were kind of visiting. And we were also then able to use the fact that the children would obviously have extended families. Now I realise already I'm saying things which starts to reduce and maybe exclude different components of a community. However, that was a great start point for us because we were going in completely cold, and we had to find ways that we could. We had to like publicise these, so we had to publicise the events in advance so we get a lot of people along to them. So the next slide, please, Drew. The venues also kind of varied. So when we actually started to design this exhibition itself, these are just give you some examples of the different venues. They're completely different. One would be huge and vast. One would be small and perhaps architectural, or the others might be very historic, and we would only be able to set up in a certain kind of way. So the exhibition and the way that we kind of communicated with the different communities had to be varied. We had to find different ways that we could actually adjust our exhibition as we get around. First of all, it had to be extremely lightweight, and we had to get around. So the next slide, please, Drew. We kind of jump forward there. But it's like, could you go to the next slide as well, please, Drew? Okay, well, that's obviously working with. Next slide as well, again, please, Drew. Okay, we'll stop and we'll talk a bit about there. But that kind of gives you an idea of the way that we decided to design these. We had to like work out how we were going to transport all this information. How were we actually going to turn it into something lightweight and safe that we could actually erect in these variety of different kind of spaces. And then we are going to have to like work out how we actually would then start to glean information from the communities that we kind of like work with. So to start with, we set up a series of kind of themes and challenges, because this is very much thinking about the future. What might housing be like in the future? And housing is always only one part of a community story. It's not just housing. Housing relates very much to the way the whole community might live, the way they might kind of like work. Housing has a huge effect on the way that work evolves, especially in the remote regions within Scotland. So we set up a series of themes and challenges that we would put to the communities, and these would then inform the information that we project onto this exhibition that people could kind of use. So we broke it up into 4 themes, which was one was kind of live, build. How do you actually live and build, and we subsequently broke that down into settlement, environment, and getting around, which is basically to do with public transport. Then we broke it down into how people might grow, and in many respects these words have dual meanings in that people grow into themselves, they grow a whole number of things, but in there we were considering well-being, healthy places, and biodiversity, and live, learn, and all that was to do with about just learning, skills, work, and influence, which I think was pretty important, which actually like just how empowered did people think they felt about the housing that they might be designed in the future. And live, share, and that's obviously that for us was kind of crucial, because that is where the kind of like, as we kind of like move towards difficult times over the next 20 years, how are the communities and how is housing going to start to change to tackle all of these kind of serious issues that we're looking at? And that would be sharing versus kind of was crucial, and that looked at adaptability in the community and also the kind of resources that were kind of available for different kinds of places and how they might kind of use them. Next slide, please, Drew. Then, coupled with that, we had to take a consideration about how we kind of live now, and we broke down 12. You'll discover is very much the magic number as we put this exhibition together, because we were going to 12 destinations, and so we also like kind of like figured out there was kind of like we pared it back. There's a lot of conversation about this, and we pared it back to kind of 12 different ways that the people in Scotland might actually live at the moment. Some of these were actually removed, if I may say, but it would include things like the travellers, self-build, co-housing, rural areas, tenements, high-rise, a lot of the different ways. So somehow we're having to convey all the different ways that we kind of currently live, and they will vary, obviously, between areas that we kind of go to. Next slide, please, Drew. So all these information was brought together in these kind of like towers, and basically they were cardboard boxes which were completely biodegradable. So the whole exhibition now has been sort of biodegraded, but there's things that we could flat pack, the things that we could transport, the things that we could actually like carry around in boxes. But in the bottom we had 12 of these towers, and they could just adapt to whatever kind of like space that we kind of went to and create an environment which within we were able to create clearings to do other things. But on the bottom we had the location, because obviously people are only so high, they're roughly 600 square. And then the first one was obviously the house, how we live now. Then we had the themes, and they were all different coloured, as you can kind of see. And the next slide, please, Drew. That created quite a landscape, quite a rich kind of landscape of the way that this exhibition, and it was as engaging as we possibly could. And a lot of time was spent on what might be the information on these exhibitions, and they were very much an exhibition that people could dip into, or an exhibition that absolutely. So we did get a lot of people which would spend 2 or 3 hours in these exhibitions taking notes, or people might just come in and pick up on a few things that kind of interested themselves. And the other kind of thought was that a nice thing was about the exhibitions were never the same, because the boxes were always assembled differently, because there's no way we're sticking all these in the back of a lorry every night and driving off to the next one. There's no way we're going to assemble them exactly the same every time round. So you didn't quite know how high rise as a method of living might then sit with whatever might be the theme that it was put against. Sometimes they'd click, sometimes they wouldn't click, and that in itself would cause a lot of conversations with the different communities that we work with, and that's us in Inverness there. Next slide, please, Drew. And as we went to these, we were tended to be in the town for a day, and we had to then sort of chart out exactly what we do. We'd work with the schools, so we'd have workshops set up with the schools, and this gives you a kind of drawing of the way. This is an early drawing, so it did kind of change how we would kind of like. There's the Isala van. That actually, I have to say this was done in partnership with Edinburgh University. I should have mentioned that at the start. We'd have early publicity. We'd unload the van. We'd set it up in itself, and we'd create different things. And we had a film. We took a film. We filmed the community everywhere we went, and that film was turned into something which accumulated, so that the film got more. So the memories and the thoughts. And we'd always interview someone specifically. They would get accumulated and build as the kind of like, as we went through. This was spread over 2 months. We were visiting these 12 destinations over 2 months. So this kind of series of stories of present voices and future lives would accumulate and develop into a whole series of kind of films, which people would view and look at and look back and see whether. Obviously, we started in Inverness. They wouldn't have very many, and then it would accumulate. But that in itself started to set off an interesting narrative that we would have with the local community, in that they would feel that they're the first, and they were kind of setting a standard, or could make their points at the start, and everybody was then interested in this right through to the conclusion in kind of Edinburgh, where they were able to then sort of say, well, we're conclusion, and we'll have a look at what everybody's kind of been said. And then there would also be an evening exhibition and presentation where the children were kind of encouraged to bring along all their families and see their work. But as we went through that, there was a series of kind of workshops, and I'll maybe just give a few examples of what they might be at the moment. We had lots of ideas at the start about how we might kind of do that, and we also asked the community to bring children to bring stuff in, so we could try and engage, finding ways that we could try and start to talk to them. Next slide, please, Drew. On its way. So we jumped to the so that was them. That's just some of the kind of like things done. But the other slide just showed you some general kind of questionnaires that we would kind of ask the people to fill in, and that would be things like basically it would. Oh,
1 second, Chris.
All right. Okay.
It's that questionnaire.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, these are some of the things that people would fill in, and it may at first glance seem, well, this is pretty, but we are, a lot of them would be things like how we live. And first of all, we'd be asking how this one's come from Irvine, which was a new town that we kind of visited. And a lot of these questions might be like, well, how do you live now? So we'd first of all, we discover how mainly the children and then the adults, how they live now, but also how would you like to live in the future? So we were actually like, and in many respects, the information we were gathering as we went through this, and we were gathering it and we were recording all of these, started to become a great kind of like data set for, or metrics, whatever you want to call it these days, for the Scottish Government to use. We'd also record the challenges and what challenges did everybody think were the most important or the biggest things that they could find kind of focus on. So we're looking for information and general discussion, but also quite specific and easy questions that people could answer, which we could then bring together and actually start to inform the Scottish Government about what their policy might be. And some of the kind of things that we got back from this, when we've gone to around 12 different places and 12 different environments, so it's quite a broad cross section of Scotland of information that we're kind of gathering in a kind of research manner. The next slide, Drew. And I think we're going to see some children's show and tell, I think was the next one. But just leave it there, Drew, because you've seen another one. But oh, well, what we would do as we kind of went through it was the first thing we would ask everybody to do is to then kind of vote. So we did actually start off by actually like holding hands up and things like this and trying to count things, but really that was just just as an impossible thing. So a very simple way was which we evolved after Inverness, because we could see what was working was just asking people to put a sticker on the in this case the way that they would like to live in the future. So people would be then taking stickers, and red was their first choice and yellow was their second choice, and then people would be sticking these on onto that, and we would basically count them up, and they would also be writing messages down as we kind of went through this as well. So we started to build up the information that we needed to then convey back to the Scottish Government as we went through that kind of process. The next slide, please, Drew. We also, I mean, this is the place standard tool. I don't know, is that a Scottish thing or is that a UK thing? I'm not quite sure, but everybody was also working with the place standard tool, which conveys a lot of interesting information, and many of our questions, such as getting around, are aligned with them. So it's having a very good close look at placemaking, which is something we've been working a lot with the Scottish Government as well. So we'd be gathering that kind of information too. Next slide, please, Drew. And that's just an example of someone the school children will have filled in and all the subject matters that they would start to look at. But it's very much, we were not looking at just purely housing. It was much more to do with the place and what influence that housing had within that place itself. That is what, and likewise the Scottish Government were very interested in that too. We'd ask people to come up with their own houses and do a bit of drawings, and many of these things we would keep and we'd talk about and whatever, but there is just a matter of perhaps getting people to think about things a bit differently and open their minds, and then that would help the kind of information that we then started to gather. So there people are obviously drawing their own houses and what they think their houses might look like in the future. Next slide, please. And we'd also, like every place we went, we would produce a map of that area. You know, if it's Skye, you know, we'd have a map of Portree, which would be next to water. If it's Glasgow, you know, we were actually like we're in the Gorbals. We went to the Gorbals area of Glasgow, is what we chose, the area we chose to visit. And then we would work with the children and the adults to then just kind of create a kind of a townscape which would be kind of completely new and adventurous, and they could open their minds up to. And we kind of like did all these as we went through the process of gathering information as well, just to help people free their minds and think clearly about what 2040 might be and how they might kind of tackle these various issues. And I realised that looks very much like a bit of fun, which is different to what the earlier speakers were kind of saying. But we had to engage with the community. So how do you actually start to engage with these different ideas and big models we think are absolutely ideal and getting people to work with these models. And each of these towns had a base which they could personalise. So that's as in Ullapool. So they would personalise that in their own different way with different things. That's probably earlier on, because then they will start to kind of like accommodate that with their own drawings and stuff like that. And the model would be close to that, would create a clearing in whatever venue we might be in with this kind of flexible kind of exhibition, and we place that in there. So each one was personalised to a degree. And these are just some kind of like of the broad statistics that we've been getting back, and these are then kind of passed on to the Scottish Government to actually use. So for example, you know, the kind of home types that people live in, that's pretty much as expected. You know, obviously most people were in detached or semi-detached in this case, but the biggest thing that the most popular form of housing in the future was custom self-built by a mile, which we were not expecting, but that is what people wanted. They wanted to have control of their houses. They wanted to have the ability to look after their houses. So this was really big, you know, and that took us aback. I don't know what we were kind of expecting, but that custom self-build was if any, whatever might be the preferred housing in the future was that, which kind of like told us quite a lot. We've got a lot more information in this, obviously, but I think I'm just picking out one that kind of stood out, really. So that was an interesting thing to put back to the Scottish Government. And then the kind of like the challenges, what were the challenges that kind of like were most important? Well, environment and well-being were by far the biggest challenges, and this is across a huge cross section of the people of Scotland. So I mean, I find consultation, I find the general public extremely knowledgeable wherever I go, and completely clued in, and they're well aware of the environmental challenge that's kind of facing us, and they want their housing to kind of react to it. I mean, well-being was in the kind of the other main factor, the main challenge they think is that just people's happiness was kind of crucial, but also healthy places and work would kind of like come in as well. So they are the kind of information that we're getting back by a mile. And then these are the kind of like highly rated categories and low rated categories. So the things that people were kind of looking for more than anything else was natural space, and that seemed to like come up the most. And then interestingly, from a kind of consultation purpose, was the sense of control. The sense of control was what people really wanted more than anything else, even though the fact that we are in the middle of a kind of consultation, which does have a level of irony to it. But I think again, I would reiterate the points made by the earlier speaker. It has to be real control. It does not have to be tokenism in any kind of a way. People were very adamant that, you know, whatever information we were gathered would find its way back to the Scottish Government and influence policy, and we've passed it on. So I feel like I've got to go around and knock on their door and say, are you taking heed of what the whole of Scotland has told you about what housing 2040 should be? And all signs I am seeing in policy changes with National Planning Framework 4, for example, which is going through the Scottish Government, these kind of messages are working their way through. In 20-minute neighbourhoods, you name it, the things that are kind of like now starting to come into reality in Scotland. I think a lot of this has been influential in it because the Scottish Government architectural team are pretty small. And then I don't know if I've overrun, but each time we went somewhere, we did a little film, and I thought it might be quite nice just to see one of these films. Now, this is going to really stretch Dhruva's technical ability, but we did one of these in each place we went, and they accumulated. So, and we had a filmmaker that helped us with it. But this maybe just gives you an example of a flavour of what it might be. This is one with the school children in particular. Will it work?
Give me 1 second, Chris.
All right.
Be patient.
It's probably quite good we got the slides mixed up because I had way too many. We had to blast.
Can you see that, Chris? Fort Worth?
I can see it, yeah.
Yeah, I can see it.
Can't hear it. I think you might have trouble with the sound actually, Dhruv, though.
Well, one second, just give me a moment.
You have to tick include computer sound on when you're sharing in the top left corner of the sharing function.
Oh dear, right, 1 second. Oh, got it. It appeared and then it vanished. Thanks for being patient, Chris.
That's all right. It takes the heat off me. I can just. I'm glad you're all patient.
Denise, where's that? Where's the tab? That
When you
click?
hit your on Teams share content, and you'll get your various windows you're allowed to pick. And in the top left corner, there's a little white box with a white circle in it that says include computer sound. You need to turn that on. It's before you start sharing.
Got you. Okay. So before I start sharing, there's the 3 dots, include
So
computer
share,
sound.
yeah, no, it's share content. So hit the white, the arrow for share content in the top right.
Got you. Yeah.
And before you select the screen you're going to share.
Got you. I can see it. Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Not to be defeated, of course. 1 second.
That's it.
That's a riddle. I like Fort William because it's got lots of mountains and clear paths, so like you can maybe go cycling or hiking, and it's got a lot of good views. And I don't really especially like how it rains all the time.
I live in a normal house just up a little tiny hill, and I really like it because it's really close to the park where I like to play, and it's the perfect place for me.
I feel like everyone in Fort William's really lucky because we live in such a beautiful place, and it's just so nice, and the rivers, the mountains, it's all beautiful. I like about it that it's got most of the shops that you would find in big cities like Inverness, Glasgow and Edinburgh, but it doesn't have everything. Now they're building a cinema, which is going to be a bit better for the children and for the adults, because it's going to be a bit more entertainment.
Fort William has a lot of nice hills to look at, and the Highlands, like the stories about what happened here.
Well, I live in a 2-flat house, and I really like the view that we have from it because we can see Ben Nevis right out of our window.
The word home means to me like laziness, spending time with my family, and just having great memories with my family. In 2040, I would like to live in a caravan that has a button, and then when you press the button, there's a big mansion that comes on top of the caravan. I'm just imagining floating cars, floating houses, just a lot more technology used for everything.
I'd like to see different houses compared to now, but people having a house that they're enjoying to live in.
In 2040, the house I would like to live in is a house over the water with stilts.
In 2040, my house will be like sort of like a castle, and it has a lot of rooms, so if any guests come over, they could sleep in their rooms, and it has a lot of space to do cartwheels and gymnastics room.
I'd like to see more people coming down to Fort William, and more houses being like built.
In 2040, I would like a house made out of glass and it's very modern.
In 2040, I would like to live in a big mansion with a golden Lamborghini.
In 2040, I want a normal house. I don't want a unique house like one on water. I want a normal house on like next to a road, and yeah.
I actually honestly wish that like pollution would stop and people would actually think about what they're doing to the earth, because that's where they live and everybody deserves a chance to live, and they're not really giving that chance to the animals either.